Hi friends, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to my channel, Sunset Bow Tarot, and welcome to day 5 of my compressed 31 days of tarot in 7 days. So I decided to do a little bit more of a close-up to talk about my top 5 favorite tarot and oracle decks of the decade, just so everybody could get a little bit of a closer look at the cards. And the first deck I'm going to start with is going to be no surprise to anybody, and that is, of course, my most beloved Touchstone Tarot by Kat Black. Definitely one of my top decks of the decade. Here it is, and this is an absolutely beautiful deck. I absolutely love it. I've talked many times about why this deck is so special to me, so I'm not going to go into it too terribly much, but there's no question that this is absolutely my favorite deck of all time and would definitely have to be number 1 on my top decks of the decade list. So again, that is the beautiful Touchstone Tarot by Kat Black. Number 2 on my favorite decks of the decade is my gorgeous Pagan Otherworlds Tarot, which, as you can see, I keep in a very special box. I absolutely love this deck. You know, you've probably already noticed that I haven't really talked about what my methodology was for which decks I chose as my top decks of the decade, and I honestly just sort of went with my heart. I mean, these are all decks that you've seen me talk about before, and you've seen me talk about the reasons why I love them and the reasons why I use them a lot, and you know why they're special to me. So and this is another one that is just, it's beautiful. It's very special. It is a very unique deck in terms of its artwork, in terms of its feel, and it's one that I personally really love and that I connect to in a really deep way. So that's the Pagan Otherworlds. The third deck on my top decks of the decade, and another one I talk about all the freaking time, so it will be no surprise to anybody. That is the Anna K Tarot. And again, this is my indie edition. As I mentioned before, I have an indie edition and I also have a mass market edition of this deck that I use when I need to take it places. And this is another one that's just incredibly special to me, that I connect to very deeply, that speaks to me very strongly, that I use for myself, I use for other people. And again, I've talked so much about all the reasons I love this deck and all of the reasons I find it meaningful and special and have a deep connection to it. And I really love this one. It's just super special. So that's the Anna K Tarot. Another deck that's got to find its way onto my top 10 of the decade, another deck that I use all the time, especially I use this to read for other people, is the Morgan Greer Tarot. And yet again, I'm pretty sure I've talked a lot about this, why I love it, why I get so much use out of it, and why it's one that's really special to me, and that again I feel speaks to me very clearly, and it's just incredibly useful. The Morgan Greer is such a useful deck to have. It's just a great reader. It's a great, solid, classic deck that always works and always gives you what you need. And it's one that I just really appreciate and love a lot. So that is the Morgan Greer. Finally, I felt like I needed to have a Rider-Waite-Smith deck on my top decks of the decade, and I strongly considered including the Centennial Rider-Waite-Smith. I use the Borderless Centennial as a study deck, and it's a deck that I use for that purpose an awful lot. And obviously, you know, top decks of the decade, I just felt like I needed an RWS on there just because it's classic and it's, you know, something that, again, you can always turn to, you can always make use of. But the actual edition that I decided to include is the edition that I actually read with the most. Like I said, with my Centennial, I use it mostly as a study deck. But if I'm going to read with a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I most often will read with my Pam's Vintage Tarot. So I decided to include that one on my top 5 of the decade as well. Even though I haven't had this for very long. I've had it for maybe a little over a year, maybe a year and a half, something like that. But I read with this one all the time. And it's a lovely edition of the Rider-Waite-Smith. It's got this beautiful vintage aged look to it. It makes it really fun to read with. And it's got a special feel to it. Again, it's, you know, it's a completely classic deck. I love the way that this edition of it, this version, focuses in on the imagery. You know, it takes off the words, it takes off the numbers, and it really just kind of has that feel of an old fortune teller's deck. And it's just, you know, it's a classic, and I enjoy this edition of it so much. So you know, as the RWS that I actually read with the most, as opposed to using for study, I feel like this one had to find its way onto my top of the decade list. You know, when I first started reading tarot, I got myself a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is the Radiant Rider-Waite-Smith, and I didn't find myself actually using it all that much, and it wasn't until into this decade that I started spending more time with the original Rider-Waite-Smith and Pixie's original illustrations and actually reading with it on a regular basis. And this one has become my favorite to read with. And I've used it quite a lot. I've read for a lot of people with it, and it's a wonderful deck. So again, that is Pam's Vintage Tarot. As a reading deck, my favorite version of the RWS, it turns out, once I started to give it some thought. I'm gonna keep it in this pretty box. So now for my top 5 Oracle decks of the decade. I have mentioned before that I am not actually a huge Oracle reader. I tend to use tarot more than anything, and I enjoy Oracle, but it's, you know, not something that I have a long history with or that I use nearly as consistently as I use tarot. And so what you'll find is that my top 5 Oracle decks of the decade are all decks that I've gotten in like the last 2 years, because that's as long as I've been working with Oracle decks, really. And so a lot of these you may have seen me do walkthroughs or talk about before, in all likelihood, because none of these are decks that I've actually had for all that long. So let's start with the Oracle deck, which when I thought about it, I kind of realized is probably my favorite Oracle deck, and honestly, I think the one that I use the most. And that is Connected and Free, The Alchemist's Oracle by Inner Hue. And here are the backs. I don't know why I connect so strongly to this one. There's just something about the artwork. There's something about the combination of the artwork with the keywords. I just think it's a really special deck, and it brings up a lot for me. It's one of those decks that just really, I like that loudspeaker came up for me just at the moment that I was about to say. It's one of those decks that really speaks to me in a very strong voice. And I really love it. There's just something about it where it just, I don't know, it's one that really, really works for me. I love the messages. I love the artwork. I love the combination of the two. It's a deck that I feel like in one card can accompany both light and shadow. I mean, when you look at this card, for example, I mean, Standstill. And there's both good and bad about the concept of standstill, and you can get both of those things from this card. It really captures a lot. I mean, like this one, Sun's Rays. Again, there's both light and shadow in this card, and there's both light and shadow in the concept. And I think that it really captures a lot. Each individual card captures a lot and brings forth a lot. And, you know, there are certain cards that, I don't know, they just speak in a really special way. And it's just it's a lovely deck. I love this one. I use this one a lot. This is, as an oracle deck, I find myself reaching for this frequently. So there's actually an interesting commonality between the deck that I just talked about, the Connected and Free Oracle, and this next deck that I'm going to talk about, which is the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit Oracle by Kim Krans, which is that both decks are ones where the creator also has a tarot deck. In the case of the Connected and Free, it's the Lumina Tarot, and in the case of the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit, it's obviously the Wild Unknown Tarot. And both of these are situations where I connected to the oracle but wasn't actually able to connect to the tarot. And I don't know what it is about this oracle. I mean, I love the artwork. I love Kim Krans' artwork. I don't entirely know why I wasn't fully able to connect to the Wild Unknown Tarot. But I really enjoy this oracle, and there's something about it that just seems really nurturing. And even though you don't have a ton of information, you know, on these cards, you know, basically this oracle deck comes in suits. There's elemental suits, you know, associated with each of the cards. And there's a lot of information in the book about each individual one of these cards. But there's also there's a real easy intuitive connection that you can have to each of the animals in these cards. And so, you know, it's easy to read this deck without referencing the book, because there's just a very strong, intuitive message that comes to mind about each one of these animals. And so, so it has such a calming, nurturing feel, and I really love this one. Something about it, it's just really special to me. And even though, yeah, I wasn't able to connect with the Wild Unknown deck, it's like the second I see every single one of these images, I have a thought about that animal and what that animal means. And, you know, it's great to look up the meanings that are given in the books for these, but the deck itself just speaks very well. And it also might just be the fact that I've used this one enough that I've gotten somewhat familiar with the system, but they have a strong intuitive pull. So this is another deck that I really like. I do like animal oracles, and another one that I've talked about that I like is the Animal Kin Oracle, but this is sort of the first animal oracle that I connected to, and something about it just really works well for me. So the next oracle deck on my top 5 of the decade is the Compendium of Constellations by Black and the Moon. And I really love this one. I love the artwork of this one. It's beautiful. It's very simple. The cards themselves are simple. You know, there's just a depiction of the constellation, and then there's a very expansive keyword on each one of the cards. And you can sort of take it as far as you want with this deck. You know, I like to pull cards from this deck and then do a little bit more research about the constellation, and I've learned so many constellations in using this deck, learned so much more about them and what the root of the, you know, mythological story is about these constellations, and learned how, you know, the keyword connects to the story. But it's a very usable deck, and you can take it as deep as you want to take it. And I also I love stars. I love stargazing. I'm interested in astronomy, and so something about this just also really speaks to me in a deep way. You know, just understanding the meanings of all these different constellations and the backstory is just something that I enjoy. Generally speaking, I enjoy it. So I think that's another reason why I really like this one. So yeah, this is another one that I use a lot. And like I said, there's just, you can really make a decision about how deep you want to go with this deck in terms of the understanding. You can just read it just based on the keywords, or you can you know, figure out the entire myth. And I think that once you do start looking at the myths, you realize that Claire Goodchild, who's behind Black and the Moon, did a wonderful job of associating the keywords with the individual constellations. And it has a ton of cards. Like there's 90 some cards in this deck, I think. It's small and it's just easy to work with, and it's a really nice oracle. So it's another one that I reach for and really enjoy when I reach for it. A couple more decks on this list, and these are decks where I've done walkthroughs and talked about them and in other videos, but I do love the Elgariel divination cards, and like I said, I talked about these a bit already, and this is just one of those decks that the artwork of this just speaks to me. And you can see there's no words on these cards, and they're just powerful. It's powerful, powerful artwork that calls up so much. And I think the reason I love this one is just the strength of my response to it. You know, it is one of those decks where you feel so much, or I do at least, I feel so much looking at these images, and they make me think of so many things. And so it's got a really amazing quality to it. You know, there's a little tiny guidebook, which I've looked at, but really the power of this deck isn't just looking at these images and letting them call forth what they call forth for you. And for me, it calls forth a lot. So I think that's why I love this one so much, is it's very, very strongly intuitive for me, and I love it. I love the artwork, and I love working with it, and I love the sort of mystery of it, and I love I love just exploring, you know, what those images call forth in me. So again, that's the Elgariel divination cards, Carte Divinatoire d'Elgariel, or whatever. I cannot pronounce French. So the final special oracle deck that I did want to talk about, that actually has ended up being one of my top 5 of the decade, is the Life Design cards by Lisa McLaughlin. And I don't know what it is about this deck, but it's something about the combination of the messages and the artwork. And the messages are strong, like advice type messages, and it really works for me in that way. And I don't have a ton of decks like this where the message is really an advice kind of message, and this one is, and this is my favorite one for that. I love the messages of these cards, and I love the feeling of the artwork, and I love how it feels so connected to the seasons. And I mean, you know, some of the cards are like really specific, and others of them are more general, and it, you know, I don't know, it calls forth a lot for me, and it always has good advice. And so I do love this one. So those are the Life Design cards by Lisa McLaughlin. And those are my top 5 tarot and oracle decks of the decade. So thanks so much, and we'll be putting up another video tomorrow.